Okay, it's 2:10. My turn. Shush. Okay. So yes, I do hope to see you all there on Friday. Unfortunately, I can't offer you extra credit. I would if I could, but this is something that you should really support your fellow students giving papers for the first time in their lives. That's tough. It's even tough giving it for the 100th time in your life, but the first time is tough. So anyway, I'll try and make an appearance myself to see how many are there. Surveillance, Conrad. Hey, you getting used to that, huh?
Hierarchical observation.
Hierarchical observation. You even have a technical term for it. Was anybody here on Tuesday?
Yes.
Let's see those hands. Who was here on Tuesday? Oh, that's right. Very good, Michael. You know which day of the week it is. That's very impressive. Who was here on Thursday? Good, just a few of you. Do you remember what you saw here?
A wonderful film.
What do you remember about the film, Sonny?
It was about Simone de Beauvoir.
It was about Simone de Beauvoir, yes indeed. What about her?
She was feminist. She wrote a controversial book that inspired and yet kind of angered women. She wrote a book called The Second Sex, which inspired while at the same time angered women.
It was inspired and angered women. Why did it anger women?
She said things that they always thought, but they never could express it. It was kind of very out there.
Out there, indeed it was. It was a scandalous book. Yes. Do anybody else remember anything about the film? Yes, no, or Grace?
She had this really open relationship.
She had a what relationship?
Open relationship.
Open.
Sartre.
With a fellow called JPS, Jean-Paul Sartre.
But it was other guys too.
Other guys too. Any women? Any women?
She adopted a daughter.
She adopted a daughter?
Kind of, not legitimately, but they were really tight.
Interesting. Yes, right. So what was her relationship with Sartre like after you saw the film?
They were together, but they didn't want to get married or anything, and then they were allowed to kind of see other people, but not, legitimately.
Oh, yeah. They were surveilling each other.
Exactly.
Anything else anybody remembers about this film last Thursday? You have great memory. Greg, were you there? What do you remember?
I just remember how it inspired not just European women, but it inspired the Argentinian exile.
Chilean, wasn't it? Was it Argentinian?
Oh, no, she's Chilean.
Thank you. What was her name? The test. What was her name? Well, it's pathetic. I've forgotten too. Anyway, okay, fine. Yes, the Chilean woman. Yes, so she had an impact across the world. Yeah. Anything else people remember? Anything else that struck you about de Beauvoir's daughters? Yes, Lars. The relationship to the mother. Yes, very fraught. Very fraught relationship, de Beauvoir with her mother and her sister.
Yeah, the sister was a little better, but
A little better. What does that mean? Okay. I guess it is a long time ago Thursday, right? Yes. All right, well, I'm not going to replay the film for you, but I am going to talk to you about Simone de Beauvoir. We are moving into the last phase of this course. The last phase. Can you believe it? The last phase. Yes. It's the culminating phase. Because the way we're going to deal with feminism is going to, and this is what you're going to have to do with your little conversations with your GSIs at the end of the semester, you're going to be having conversation with them about first feminism and then how to look at the remaining, the theories that we've already done through the lens of feminism. Yes. Now, of course, as you may have noted en route, there are not many theorists that we dealt with. In fact, probably zero theorists that we dealt with who have already talked about women. There was one gentleman who talked about women, remember? Marx Weber Durkheim. That's very interesting. What did Marx have to say about women? Yes, Greg. Sorry? Yeah, there was that moment, that sentence about the natural division of labour in the family and the latent slavery in the family. Who else said something about? Yes, Jessica.
Didn't Marx say that women and children were brought in to be exploited?
Women and children were brought in to be exploited. Yes, indeed, he did say that. Very good, very good. Anybody else say anything about gender, women? Anybody else? Yes, Aaron.
Did Smith say something about women?
Very good. Yeah, he talked about the education of women. In fact, they don't really need education because they're educated in the family and their destiny is presumably domestic work. One wouldn't know it was inherent or whether this was socially produced, but anyway, that is what he said. Indeed, he did. Anything else? Anybody else said something about women? Come on! Yes, sir.
there were times that I said that women are better suited to arts and religion stuff, and then I said more stuff.
That's right. Very good. Who are you?
Conrad.
You're another Conrad. Very good. Conrad number 2. Perking up with feminism. Very good. Yes, indeed. Durkheim had these comments about the sort of the characteristics, the essential characteristics of women and men. And women were more inclined to emotions and aesthetic indulgences, whereas men were intellectual people, rational, and they have bigger brains too. But that's beside the point. Yes. So there was a gender division of labour. Anybody else say anything about gender in this course? Yes, Monica.
They say that women are more traditional labor.
Ah, very good, very good. In the proselytic spirit of capitalism, he talked about those German, I think he referred to them as girls, who were more inclined to work only as so far as they got the necessary income they expected to get, and didn't have that work ethic. Ah, very good. Anything else? This is terrific. Anything else? 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 Did Foucault have anything to say about women? Matthew?
It's a little fuzzy, but I recall that he was talking about the feminization of the colonized, right? Wasn't that part of what he talked about?
Foucault?
Oh, did you say Fanon?
I said Foucault. Okay, well, we'll deal with Fanon in a minute. Yes, Fanon, I don't know. Fanon, what we read, I don't think said anything about women. Hey, alright, very good. Good. So, the point is that they haven't said much to say. So, we've just summarized what they all said about gender. So there's not much point in accusing them for, there's not much point spending much time looking for gender in the theories that we dealt with. But we will see that feminists begin to think about theory in a fundamentally different way than these gentlemen that we have dealt with. And so it'll force us to rethink and reconceptualize and perhaps re-criticize those people. Not because they left gender out, that they certainly did, but because of the way that they theorize. They theorize the world as if they were outside the world. Whereas we will see that feminists theorize the world knowing that they are part of the world that they theorize, which poses a whole set of new problems for social theory. Alright, that's my first little introduction to Beauvoir. Let me just say about Simone de Beauvoir, because she is the greatest. I don't understand why people don't spend more time on this book, but they apparently don't. I think I'm the only one who teaches this book in this department, which is a crying shame. But anyway, it is an amazing book. It's very thick, because I didn't get you to buy it. I just wanted to let you know it's very thick, and it's got a lot of amazing accounts of the life of women and the life of relations between men and women. I will talk about different parts of the book perhaps next time. Let me just say that this book came out of nowhere. De Beauvoir. Who was de Beauvoir first? She lived from 1908 till 1986. And she was a brilliant French philosopher, writer, novelist, commentator, and she was very famous for her 4-volume autobiography, which recounted the life of the intellectual in France, mainly in France. But when Jean-Paul Sartre and Beauvoir became very famous, they traveled the world. They were very involved with communist movements, had an ambivalent and ambiguous relationship to the communist movement, were very famous for their left critiques, their left-wing criticisms of various regimes in the world. De Beauvoir in particular was quite close at certain points to Frantz Fanon. Frantz Fanon himself was a student of Jean-Paul Sartre, and as I'll show next time, his ideas are very similar in some ways to those of de Beauvoir, he about race, she about gender. Yes? And unfortunately, when we think of de Beauvoir, we also think of a fellow called J.P. Sartre, Jean-Paul Sartre. There was a very notorious relationship, an open relationship. In fact, I think, not that I really know, but I think they were really lovers. From the biographies that we have, they were lovers for a relatively short period of time. In their youth, they were very, very distinguished intellectuals, philosophers, even from their early years in France. When they were students, that's when they met. But later on, they were always, in a sense, lifetime partners and shared each other's lives, even if they were not lovers. And she was very unusual in the sense that she was not only such a distinguished intellectual, but that she led a relatively independent life and was quite sort of severely honest about the relationships she had with people around her and about the relationships others were having around her. Some of a sexual character and some of a less sexual character. But mainly I think she was interested in the intellectuality of the period in which she lived. And of course that changed over time. She and Sartre sort of shared students, and that was always a sort of ambiguous relationship they had to their students, very intense and very close. It was like a sort of extended family in which there was a sort of circulation of people. Yes, well we'll go. You can read what's the name of the great biography of Beauvoir? I've forgotten the author. Okay, I'll tell you next time, for those who are interested. Yes, right. And she had one very well-documented love affair, very famous one, with a U.S. poet, novelist by the name of Nelson Algren, who she met in Chicago. And I think a lot of this book actually is shaped by the way that she was thinking about her relationship with him. It was a very intense love affair that went on for 4 or 5 years, transatlantic. And transatlantic in those days, between 48 to 52 or something like that, was a more complicated business than it is today. And so there were lots of letters went backwards and forwards. And we have actually recently the letters that Simone de Beauvoir wrote to Nelson Algren have been published. Anyway, that is de Beauvoir. And what is now interesting about her theory is that she, in a sense, is part of the theory that she is explicating. And she uses her own life to explicate that theory. And so it is, in a sense, whereas many of the theorists that we dealt with so far have largely been concerned with macro institutions and perhaps have looked at the consequences that has for individuals, de Beauvoir actually, in a sense, starts with the personal and then locates that in its more historical context, as she does in this book. So she's looking at gender relations as they are produced and reproduced in different historical contexts. That part of the book, of course, we will not be reading. What we're reading, essentially, is her broad theorization of what we can call male domination. Okay, that was my sort of little background for de Beauvoir. Second, well, as I said, she was a public intellectual in France, and when The Second Sex came out in 1949, it came out of nowhere. I mean, it was, The Second Sex, this book was really just emerged out of a conversation, well, that's how she presents it in her autobiography, that she was having with Jean-Paul Sartre, who actually sort of implanted the idea in her head, according to her own account. It came out in 1949, and when it appeared, it created an enormous scandal. An enormous scandal called The Second Sex. It was a sort of an expose of the relations between men and women, the likes of which nobody had ever seen before, ever read before. Even though she draws on much of her data, quote, data in this book is drawn from novels, mainly by men but some by women, about and bringing them together into an account of women as the second sex. Something that was never spoken about in the terms that she presented it, namely a relationship of domination. Women were presented as different from men, but that was because they had an essentially different nature character. But no one had, in this way that she did, thematized the character of domination that was implied in that relationship. Yes, and so people really went to town. France has got this very active public intellectual life, and they really went to town on her and attacked her in very crude ways. Yes, this book, as I think the film indicated to you, prefigured what we call now second wave feminism, the feminism that grew up in the 1960s and 1970s, particularly in Europe, but also, as Greg said, elsewhere in the world. But it first, I think, grew up in Europe, and the feminist movement was very influenced by this book. Who was in the film? Kate Millett, Anne Oakley, Betty Friedan was actually not interviewed, but these are the very famous feminists of the 1960s and 70s. They'd all read The Second Sex, all been influenced by it. Juliet Mitchell, Gail Rubin, we're going to be reading Cathy McKinnon, Dorothy Smith. Dorothy Smith is a sociologist who was actually trained, in quotes, in this department, who got a PhD from this department in the 1950s, and she wrote, I don't know if anybody has read it here, an article called Sociology for Women. No, that's very sad too. I should be really spending the entire semester on feminism, shouldn't I? Yes, Dorothy Smith. Well, anyway, she wrote this one, and you can see, even though the references to de Beauvoir are few and far between, you can see how deeply influenced she is by the ideas of de Beauvoir. And so, in fact, that is very true. One of the most interesting things about second wave feminism is that they were actually transformed by this book, many of them, but actually in their writings, the references to this book are often few and far between. So she has been, in a sense, silenced not just by men, but also by women. Yes, right. Anyway, reading this book for many at the time in the 1960s, things that perhaps you will take for granted, but for many women in the 1960s and 70s, this was a transformative experience, just reading this book. Well, yes, much has changed since then. When de Beauvoir was writing, and it's very important you understand this, when de Beauvoir is writing, in France, women had just got the vote. It's 1949. Women got the vote in 1944 in France. Do you know when they got the vote in the United States of America? Very good. You got the right. I mean, if you could do in a chorus, that's pretty good. 1920s. Well, actually, 1920 was the year. Very good. So it was not so long ago, less than a century. But when Beauvoir is writing in 49, it's only 5 years after women had the vote. Imagine that. And of course, at that time, there were very restrictive. There was great restrictions on birth control and abortion. So the freedoms that we perhaps take for granted today, in many parts of the world, the richer world at any rate, were not available to women. So again, when we read this book, we have to understand that she says, the situation of women was very different then than it is today. And indeed, one may argue that she set in place the foundations for the feminist movement, which, of course, was responsible for many of the progressive changes in the freeing of women from restraint and restriction. So she became a figure that sort of set in motion the feminist movement of the 60s and 70s. Or at least, she was somebody who actually became a reference, a sort of Bible for that movement. Yeah. And of course, the other big change that has occurred in the last 50 years is the entry of women into the labor force and, of course, into the educational system. I mean, she was totally unique in the fact that she was such a distinguished. There was no other women of her distinction, quite of her distinction at the time. So she was quite unique as an intellectual. Women did not parade in the public